second in our series of 6 webinars regarding advancing recovery. We are, just to give a shout out to the Department of Healthcare Services, they have funded this and made it possible for us to bring Rick Gosha as our key expert faculty throughout the series. He'll be our primary presenter today, as he was last time. We're also very excited to have 2 panelists from San Francisco Behavioral Health Services. Lisa Winch, who has become quite expert in the strength assessment process, will be describing how she learned to use the strength assessment and what it's meant for her practice and her clients. And Gloria Frederico, who is the Wellness and Recovery Coordinator in San Francisco, will be describing more of an organizational perspective for supporting the strengths model and the use of the strength assessment in particular. If you did not listen to the first session, hopefully you have discovered it by now as a recording. And if you haven't heard the recording and want to, it's still available, and this one will be as well. So any team members that are not a part of today couldn't catch up. And in the future, if you're ever worried that you'll miss a session, they'll always be recorded, and you can listen to it at your convenience. Real quickly, to give you just a reminder about the GoToWebinar functionality, be sure to be familiar with the control panel, how to maximize the menu, how to manage your audio button, type in questions, which we encourage throughout, and we will have some time periodically to stop for them as well. If you haven't used the question button before, you can practice and just indicate that you've received the materials that we sent out. You should have received the slides and a couple of Word documents. Next slide. What I want to say a little bit more talking about now is we're going to be offering continuing education credits. If you want them, there's something you need to attend to right now. In the question box in the menu, you need to indicate the name and email address of each individual who will be requesting educational credits. You need to do this within the first 15 minutes of the session. So just a reminder that where to put your list in. We need to make sure, of course, to attend the entire session. And then post this session, we will send to you the packets that you need to complete in order to actually qualify for the credits. There will be 1.5 credits for the hour and a half that the session is, and they will be $15. So just a nice opportunity for those that want to take advantage of the availability of continuing education credits. So I'm going to shift now quickly and give you a sense of the agenda. We're going to revisit Elizabeth's story, so hopefully you'll recognize the name. Rick last time shared a bit about her background and how he began to use the strengths model in her service and supports. And he's going to go into great depth about her strengths goals and progress, and particularly how he used the strength assessment methodology around those particular parts of her care. And he's going to go really into depth about the strength assessment. This is the primary function or focus of today, is helping to identify client strengths and learning how to amplify them, make them useful, and set the stage for a lot of good goal progress. He's also going to introduce a second individual that he's worked with for years, or actually who's been worked with by a case manager on his team. He's going to tell the story, the case manager story in working with Jacob, and the supervisor story in working with the case manager. So you can see and learn how the strength assessment it impacts all those levels. Building on that, then we'll have the San Francisco stories of Gloria and Lisa describing how they've adopted the strengths assessment in practice and organizationally. And we'll wrap up just reminding a little bit about the strengths assessment, about strengths practice orientation scale. And actually, we're going to weave that particular topic in throughout the sessions, this particular session and the future ones. And then we'll wrap up. We do have some recommended next steps for you between now and the next session. The actual orientation scale, which we introduced last time, is designed really to help you as in your own individual practice, in your team, in your programs, and in your agency, really assess where you are today in the 5 elements that are core to the strengths model practice. The client-centered goal identification and achievement, the identification and use of client strengths, goal planning, contact with individuals, and individual movement through the system. Rick, let's show them the scale. We're going to be focusing on the first two items today. Item 1, client-centered goal identification and achievement, and 2, identification and use of client strengths. If you individually or as a team have not scored yourself, we do recommend taking a little bit of time during the call and give yourself a score for those two items. And then as you learn more today about these practices, you may reconsider your scores and decide if you need to revise them, because your understanding of these items will deepen, hopefully, through what Rick will be training on today. We're going to actually ask you for your scores today, but we will in later webinar series. In some of the upcoming sessions, we'll be asking you through polls to tell us your scores, so we kind of see how folks are doing out there. All of it is anonymous for certain. And ultimately, the point of this is to build awareness within you and your team of where you are versus where you want to be. So if you have a gap in your current practice orientation that you want to address, then this will hopefully help clarify what that gap is and begin to build some ideas around what to work on based on your learning from Rick and our panelists to improve your scores and obviously your outcomes. So at this point, and just a quick reminder, don't forget to chat into to write into questions if you're going to be requesting CEs. We need them in the next 7 minutes if you haven't yet. So please do write them in so we can get you the packets and make sure you actually can qualify for the educational units. But as a reminder, we are absolutely delighted to have Rick Gosha working with us in California. He's been a long-time consultant for CIVHS and has helped us in a variety of improvement projects for a good 5-6 years now. He comes from Kansas and is one of the developers with Charles Rapp of the Strengths Model. As you can see, his book is well developed, and it's in its 3rd edition, and I think he's already working on his 4th. And what's exciting about learning through Rick is that he's really had all the different kinds of roles that the folks out in our audience right now probably are in. So from a practicum student to a case manager to a team leader, program manager, and now director of an agency, he's really experienced and applied the Strengths Model. So it's wonderful to have those different vantage points. So as we have time for questions, it's a wonderful opportunity for you to understand Rick's evolution of his own practice and management with the Strengths Model and what he's observed amongst others. So Rick, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. My target was to get us to 12:10, and here we are.
Very good. Well, I'll just jump right into it. In the very first session that we had, we talked about the Strengths Model, but really didn't talk about so much about what exactly that it is. We introduced one of the tools, but what I wanted you to see is that the tools that we'll be talking about specifically today, the Strengths Assessment, fits it within inside of a larger model. And the Strengths Model was developed in the mid-1980s as really a case management model for community-based services, and really in response to a lot of deficit-based approaches that were being used at that time. And it's evolved a lot. It's been applied to different populations. It's expanded to some different settings, but it really is a community-based model. And it's both a philosophy as well as a set of tools, and it's really designed to help promote recovery for people with serious mental illness. And in terms of the philosophy, it really hinges on the way that we view the people that we serve. And the way we would look at it in the Strengths Model is that any person that we come into contact with has this capacity, this ability to make strides in their own recovery. And we know that we're very poor predictors of who can recover and who won't recover, so we don't even try to within the model. So therefore, even if you're working with someone who's had a 25-year addiction, long periods of homelessness, hospitalization, we still enter that helping relationship believing in the possible. It's also a way of being in relationship with the people that we serve, and I like to equate it as being more of a traveling companion rather than a travel agent. It's really an intimate way of really engaging with people about what's meaningful and important to them, and then helping them to achieve those goals. And there's specific tools and methods on this. Today we're going to be talking about the Strengths Assessment, but in future sessions we'll be introducing the Personal Recovery Plan. We'll be talking about group supervision, how to help people when they get stuck trying to achieve certain goals, and field mentoring as a way of building skills for practitioners to be able to work in these techniques, methods, etc. with people. But to understand the Strengths Model, you really have to kind of understand the context of which it's being introduced. And the way that we typically teach using any of the tools is viewing the end of the story first. Why are we even doing this type of work? So we had a definition for recovery last time, but this time I'm just going to use recovery as a very simplistic definition, very subjective, something that makes life worth living for people, that beyond the mental health system, that brings meaning and purpose and a positive sense of identity to the person. So when you're going to that first meeting with people, that's your focus. Even when you're initially engaged with them, what tools that you're using, they should all lead to this end of the story. And it's going to be differently defined for each person that you look at. But that point of engagement is really about beginning to understand where the person is at that point in time, and start to understand about what does bring meaning and purpose in their life. Creating a sense of hope of what's possible. And important is to find some alliance between what people find as meaningful and purposeful in their lives, what they're wanting for their lives in terms of recovery, and where do we play a role in that. And when we do have a role, it's the tools and methods that really help to move us from that point of engagement to that ultimate goal of recovery, and hopefully people moving beyond our systems of care. And that's exactly what the strength assessment is for, is really to start to open up that narrative about what a person finds meaningful and important. What would recovery look like to that person? Where the personal recovery plan is really about taking very concrete steps to help them make movement. And it doesn't mean that it has to be linear, it just means that you have to have movement. And what I said about group supervision earlier is, what happens when we're making movement and then we find blocks and barriers? How do we get past those things? There's a set of principles that guide the strengths model. The first one I've said, we view every person as having the capacity to recover, reclaim, or transform their lives. But an important part of the model is that even though there's this focus on strengths, it doesn't mean that we ignore deficits in the model. We acknowledge already that the work that we do is often messy. People come to us because often they do have a need. They're having difficulty achieving things that they want in their life. So we use strengths and the focus on strengths as a way to help people either overcome deficits to achieve a goal or to actually achieve the goals that they want themselves. And even as we use a focus of strengths within the person, we also look at the same view within the community. We can look at any community and find that, we see pockets of barriers, burnt bridges, blocked doors, and stigma, discrimination, etc. But also within any community that there are niches where people can thrive, any person that we work with. And part of the strength assessment is also about understanding people's capacities and where are their niches where they can actually thrive and have competence and confidence, and that's how we focus it, because not all of us will actually thrive in every single area with our own communities. The client's the director of the helping process, and this really starts to bring in a lot of things around shared decision-making techniques. It's not just that the client says they want something and we guarantee that it's going to happen. What we do is that we understand the client and we really talk about how do we make this happen together. This mutual ownership of the person taking ownership for their own lives in recovery and us taking some ownership on what we bring to the table to actually help them achieve it. In this model, you'll see that the worker relationship, client relationship is primary and essential. It's not the tools. The strengths assessment will be having a lot of focus today, but what you'll see is it's the person behind it that is actually the most valuable tool. You can take a strengths assessment and fit bad practice within inside of it, and it doesn't change anything. Really it's the skills of the practitioner and their own recovery and bringing together all the skills that they already know within mental health. And this tool, in a sense, takes some life in terms of being able to become a repository or an organizational tool to help us be able to have some more direction within our work and purpose. And the primary setting for our work is in the community. We'll always say over and over that, even with the best services that we have, recovery does not happen within the walls of our mental health center. They happen out within the community. So a lot of stress is on the use of naturally occurring resource, building people's capacities to help them achieve the lives that they want. I'm not going to go over these right now, but I do want you to know that there have been 10 studies that have tested the effectiveness of the strengths model, and all of them have shown positive outcomes versus treatment as usual. 4 of those have been experimental or quasi-experimental. There's also been 6 post-test pre-post type of studies, and we can get you access to any of that stuff that you want if you want to be able to find a little bit more about the strengths model itself. But some of the outcomes that we've noticed some of the greatest improvement, we've been collecting data here in Kansas since 2002 on a very client level basis, and we've seen definite improvement in the areas of psychiatric hospitalization, housing, employment, and those other things that are listed there. But if we're going to talk about the strengths model, we have to first of all define what do we mean by strengths. There's a lot of times that we deal with other agencies that say, well, we kind of already do the strengths model, and so you ask them a little bit more about, so tell me a little bit more about how you're doing that, and they'll talk about that, we have this 4-page initial assessment or intake, and there's a box in there where we ask people, what are your strengths? And that alone just doesn't make the strengths model, and in fact, usually when we think of people's strengths, we think about their qualities and their personal characteristics. A person has a good sense of humor, they're hardworking, they're dedicated, and while these are strengths, they're probably the least usable of all the different types of strengths that we look at in the model. So when we think about a strengths assessment, it's going to be populated by some of these other strengths, and that's what you want to really pop out. Some of those things being talents and skills that people bring, and it's more than what we're really looking for is sometimes the active ingredients that go underneath a talent and skill. Not knowing that a person just knows how to play the guitar, but kind of knowing that how does that play in their own health and wellness. So knowing that a person plays guitar and they use that to help them feel less anxious in a stressful situation. Well, that's a very specific use of a talent or a skill. We also look at environmental strengths, and once again, we're looking at trying to get at very highly usable strengths, getting them in their most usable form. So hopefully what you see on a strengths assessment is not just that mom, brother, or a case manager are their supports, but really knowing what makes them a strength. And that's usually the critical question of anything that you'll see on the strength assessment is what makes this specifically a strength. So knowing that how a mother actually supports a family member is a great strength to be built upon, rather than just having names listed. And we'll show that here in just a second. And the last one is interests and aspirations. Just the fact that somebody desires something is a great strength. A lot of times is that a person maybe desires something that they don't necessarily have all the talents and skills that are built up, or the environmental strengths that will help them to be able to achieve it. But usually that's some of the internal motivation that helps people move forward and to develop those things, to continuously to put in the hard work of whatever it takes to achieve a goal that's meaningful and important in their life. So we go back to Elizabeth, and we looked at Elizabeth's initial strengths assessment last time that we were together. You'll see how these strengths kind of pop up. What we've done is actually taken the color coding of these different types of strengths and let you see how these are kind of populated here. Where the middle column is really talking about the aspirations that Elizabeth had. And this was a very hope-inducing thing for her, where it started to, in a sense, build upon what was she really wanting out of life. But probably more importantly is that what were the resources that she brought to this? And if you look at that very first part of the column, you see different environmental strengths. You see skills and stuff that she can use then to be able to help make this particular goal possible. And if you remember from Elizabeth's story last time, in her own mind and even the worker's mind, there was a lot of doubt about whether she could even accomplish this. And this was a hope-inducing thing for her to see that she did have a lot of things that she brought to the helping relationship, and even things that she had used in the past that were helpful. So as you see a good, well-written strengths assessment, you're going to see that these kind of talent, skills, and aspirations and desires will be really kind of popping out and really starting to create this narrative recovery for the person. And since the strengths assessment is a tool that's not supposed to be just done once at a time, is that what we see is that even a year later, not that you wait a year before doing another strengths assessment, but as it evolved over time, things shift for her. So you see that we have additional talents and skills, or things that were desires that now are current strengths, things that are were strengths at one time that are now strengths in the past. And so you still see that these are the things that you're drawing from to help a person be able to make forward movement in their own recovery. So this organization of the strengths assessment is is quite simple, and it would be nice if that all these fields were already populated, but this is where it takes a skilled practitioner, is that, there's these blank 7 life domains there, which would be, things like their housing, their daily living situation, employment or education, or even specialized knowledge, their supportive relationships, spirituality, culture, etc. And then there's the 3 temporal orderings. So what's our strengths that they can access right now? What are strengths that they've been able to access in the past, and what are their desires? So it encompasses really some simplicity as well as complexity. It's a very simple form to use, but it really takes the skilled clinician to start to think about how to mine for these types of strengths. It would be really nice if people came in, or even like Elizabeth. It wasn't that, you just bring out the strengths assessment and she starts to tell you everything. It's a slow process of getting people to talk and think, and then for the worker to help organize those things. And when we get into Jacob's strengths assessment, we'll talk about that a little bit further about how that's done. But there are some critical components that make this strengths assessment work. And first of all, it's what are you actually getting onto the strengths assessment? First of all, anything that you put on there, it needs to be in this context that's meaningful and important to the person. So with Elizabeth, as we talked about last time, her things that she led off with is that I want my own place. And then another thing that she started to talk about over time is that she felt lonely and she wanted more people to do things with. So when you're collecting strengths, that you're not just using this as like an interview, that what you're doing is that you're asking questions about, well, have you had your own place before? And what were some things that helped you to be able to do that? What are ways that you've interacted with friends before? You're always asking them questions in order to help them achieve that goal. It's also a hope-inducing experience for the person. So just the process of exploring possibilities and then visualizing these tangible things can create this aura of hope. And that's really what it did with Elizabeth, even before she'd even taken a single step. The fact that these discussions were happening was something that was very new to her. She wasn't, and that was one comment that she'd actually made, is that I'm not used to being asked things like this, because a lot of the focus for her was trying to get her to stay out of the hospital, quit calling the crisis line, things around suicidal ideation. And this was really kind of starting to set up the meaning of, why should you stay out of the hospital? Why should you try to find different ways to deal with your own kind of things going on inside of you without cutting behaviors, or how to do anything. It's the why. It's also thorough, detailed, and specific, and that's like with, for example, specifically for Elizabeth, is that Brother Roy was a person that she wouldn't have actually even called a strength, but the fact that Roy had a car and could take him places, that's what made Roy a strength. So in areas that he was very difficult for her to deal with, this is where he was a strength. And the same thing about medications. Actually Elizabeth was on a couple different medications, and she found the Lamictal helpful, and this is why, but she didn't find the Seroquel helpful, even though she still filled her prescription, or sometimes she didn't fill her prescription. But it's starting to find out is that not only that you're taking medications, but exactly how is it helping you in your recovery. And that was actually very important when Elizabeth later on decided to try a different antipsychotic and to kind of more evaluate how is that now helping her to be able to deal with a lot of the voices that she experienced once she actually moved into her apartment. And it's written from the person's perspective using their own words. And so in a good strengths assessment, as you've seen before, is that you're going to have a lot of things as I want. It's not written in the third person, or I have these things. It really should be their kind of narrative speaking outward, not something that we're writing about the person. But that's the content part of it. There's also a way that you go through a strengths assessment with somebody. And first, importantly, is that it evolves at that person's pace. So, if you're starting to do a strengths assessment and about 10 minutes into it that the person starts kind of glazing over their eyes, you stop. If a crisis happens in the middle of an appointment, you stop. The important part is that it's opposed to rushing to fill out the paperwork, and the primacy comes on keeping the person engaged. And as long as they're willing to kind of talk about these things, that's when you're going to get the most information. And it's conducted in a conversational manner as opposed to an interview. So you don't need to start in the upper left-hand corner, but you start wherever it's meaningful to the person. I know exactly for Elizabeth where it started out for her was just like what she liked to do in her free time, and she was talking about her love of country music and singing, and and even though she didn't do a lot of dancing at that time, reflecting about how that she used to do a lot of dancing and how she knew how to do line dances and stuff. So that's where it started, and then it started to evolve from there. It also occurs in the person's natural environment whenever possible, as opposed to having a majority of meetings in the office. There's going to be times that work is done in the office, but there's something that's very important about actually just being in the environment where people are at. And sometimes it's the nature of that goal. I know that for Elizabeth, a lot of times it was spent meeting, out in the community after going to look at a few apartments, or doing it actually in her own home. And sometimes even just those interactions can draw out strengths that you wouldn't have seen before. And also that it's a part of an ongoing process, and that's where that you saw on Elizabeth's strengths assessment that there was a 2010 version and a 2011, and that doesn't mean that they were all done at different times. Is that there was modifications of the strengths assessment throughout that entire process. So it's not a one-time thing, but really you're thinking about that you're creating a portrait or building this narrative rather than just completing the form. So I just showed an example right here of a strengths assessment. It's an actual strengths assessment. It's not typed up like Elizabeth's, and kind of similar to what Elizabeth might have looked like in her early times. Is that we always talk about that you don't really need to rewrite it until it's so messy that you just can't even do anything else with it. And so in this one you see different colored pens. There's either coffee or I'm not sure, it could be blood stains on that, but they get messy. And it's something that you really want to be real. You're not really, in a sense, doing this as an assessment for, a Medicaid form. I mean, really, what you're doing on here, it's a tool. It's a tool to help you be able to better understand the lens that that person is using in their life, because really, it's a person's own internal motivation that's going to be your biggest strength and ally in terms of helping people progress in their recovery. So there's lots of uses to the strengths assessment. You can use it just to get to know a person as part of engagement. You don't necessarily have to have a goal right away. In fact, a lot of people that we work with, may not exactly know what they want in their life, or they're too overwhelmed to think about what they want. So that's okay. The context there would be that, I know right now it's hard to think about what you want, but I'd like to introduce this tool to kind of look at, just what life is looking like for you right now, what's meaningful, what's important, and maybe just to see where we may have a role in helping you, with your recovery, or even starting to explain recovery. But you do want a context that's going to allow you to start taking some movement. So whether it's a person saying that they want to work again sometime in their life, or go back to school, or raise their child, you're trying to capture that passion. And a lot of it's just trying to help people just to envision something beyond the present time. And that's a great tool sometimes when you have people that have kind of been in this plateau mode for a long time, or in the stabilization, or even worse than that, they've become just passive recipients of mental health services with no thought about even ever existing outside of it. So it starts to help them kind of communicate this recovery journey, and to really amplify the well aspects of the person, because people are sometimes very conscious, as well as the team is, of people's deficits. And this is taking something or adding some information that's usually not always typically available when we're working with people. It's also to help us develop strategies. So once Elizabeth started getting her apartment, then there were different things that she wanted in her life, including that she wanted to get involved in different things in the community. So now it was starting to look at those strengths and think about, where might be those avenues where you might find a niche. For Elizabeth, it was very important that it was used to celebrate her own accomplishments over time. The best way, in a sense, for her to keep her hope building was the fact that she saw that she was making movement. And even some of those small pockets of movement were celebrated as something very big. And also just to highlight those seemingly ordinary things, that they didn't really view as something that was so impactful. Even like with Elizabeth, just, her ability to sing was just something that she did, but eventually that led to her being able to sing in a church choir. So what was once ordinary now becomes a powerful tool in her own recovery. So what I wanted to do, and we are going to be moving to a new client, But I wanted to use Elizabeth right now as a way just to kind of explain a little bit about how all this stuff kind of comes together, since you're familiar with her, before we go on to a new person and restart about how you actually use the strengths assessment. But I wanted to show you the progress notes, and just a few that I took out. One is an example of a progress note where the strengths assessment was being used very early on in the relationship just to help align with her. So I'm very familiar with the work that was done on there, and I'll show you the progress note that went behind it. And then the second one that you're going to see is where that Elizabeth had already, she was actually very close to moving into her apartment, and there were some barriers that she had some concerns at. So once again, the strength assessment was pulled in and used in a very specific way, and you're going to see the progress note behind it. The progress notes are really important, I think mostly because it helps create this storyline that anybody on the outside can look in and see what's going on. And it doesn't have to be always perfectly linear, because people are going to take a few steps forward and take several steps back. But you're still seeing at least some purposeful work, and it's a very important thing as a supervisor to kind of be able to look into the progress notes and sometimes see where people are actually getting stuck. So let me just kind of just show you up some progress notes here, but I do want to show you the way that there's lots of different ways to teach documentation, and I'm not saying that this is the best way to do it, but it's the one that I've probably had the most comfort with. I've probably experience probably every acronym that you can think of in terms of progress notes. But what I like about this, I call it just GIRP plus, is that one is that it focuses on the goal, and you know, it forces workers to say right up, what is the goal that you're working on, and hopefully you're getting to the point to where that goal is either something that you know, maybe it's something that the client wasn't initially interested in, but then you start with what you got and you're starting to build something that's more meaningful and important, or that you're starting from something that you already know that's meaningful and important, and you're starting to show what are the interventions that you're using. So establishing your role and hopefully using something that has some kind of evidence base behind it. You know, the worst thing you want to do for a funding source is to show notes for, you know, a 5-year period of time and that none of the interventions are working. So there's sort of come to a point to where it's like, you know, we need to try something different. The client response is going to be a part of that, how they're responding to things, and then of course your next steps. And the plus part that I add to that is just important observations that have relevance to that particular situation. So for example, like within Elizabeth's case, she had a long history of suicidal ideation, calling the crisis line, going in and out of the hospital. So sometimes touching base and kind of seeing where she was at in suicidal ideation is an important observation to have. It may not be important with another person. If substance use might be something that's very central, that's a barrier to a person to achieve a goal, and it's something that you're working on, well, sometimes those are important observations. But, you know, for me, it's like we don't want to make notes too long. They need to be short, concise, and hopefully meaningful. And even if a client decided to read their own progress notes, that it would be very clear that what was done in that meeting was exactly how it was recorded. So believe it or not, actually, progress note writing can be fun. So here is a progress note from Elizabeth, and I'm going to show you kind of just the narrative version of this, and then I'm going to show it to you in a form where it actually breaks everything out in that GIRP kind of thing. But some things should pop out to you really quick here is that, you know, the goal at that time initial was not Elizabeth wanting to get her apartment. Elizabeth really didn't have a goal. But what was on the treatment plan was helping her to stay out of the hospital. And I think she would say that that's fine, but you know, even that really didn't stop her from going in and out of the hospital. But they were still looking at that, but the purpose really is to try, as the intervention, is to start finding a way to find why a person might want to stay out of the hospital and even start to take care of her own well-being. So once again, you're using the strengths assessment as an intervention. We're noting no suicidal ideation because that's what was going on at that particular time. But it's also bringing in the fears, you know, that she did have a lot of nervousness about living on her own. And if you read other notes that were around this, is that her mom was actually not wanting her to move into an apartment. We mentioned that in the first session. And in this note, really, it kind of brings it to a central point that, she wants to live on her own, but she really also wants mom's support. So that's going to be also, that's going to frame interventions in the future. So we're mining again about, the time that she did live on her own. And even though it only lasted for 5 months, it wasn't all that great, it definitely had some learning that was helpful. So it goes on to there. It shows a little bit more where she said that it gave hope. So there was a little short outcome, and then it gives the next steps. So if I was writing this in that GIRP format, you can see it's a little bit less overwhelming, that you can see very specifically the goal, what your intervention was, the response of the client to the intervention, and then the plan from there. And hopefully that if you stack notes upon notes, that the storyline goes from the plan to writing what you do next time. So just wanted you to kind of see that on there. Your own agency may have different things that you want to either add in or that you require in a note, and that's completely fine. At least in the own system that I have, we work very closely with the Medicaid authority here, the auditors who look into charts within our licensed community mental health centers, and this note will pass. And that's important. You know your systems better than I know your specific systems. But I think you get the point. The second one is what you're seeing is that a different way of using the strengths assessment. Here at this time, her goal was getting an apartment. So really, every time that they got together to work on the apartment, that starts off that entire note. But then it starts to draw in about why are you involved in this? And a lot of it was because that she had a lot of anxiety around this because she was still struggling with command voices. So then once again, there's an intervention, wellness recovery action plan, does have an evidence base behind it, and they were used in a very specific way. She says that these things are helpful. Then this is a note actually does include the personal recovery plan, that they're adding some steps onto it. And then they're going to be meeting in the next week to start to talk about whether some of those strategies actually worked, so they keep involving that and learning from that. Once again, I want to show you again how, if you break this in, what it looks like in terms of an actual note. But you do see on there the goal, the intervention, the response, and the plan. And we can talk a little bit more about this in some future sessions where we're going to talk a little bit more about documentation. But I do want to set up the stage that, your documentation should really start to explain the interventions that you're using and your role in it. So that really kind of brings these puzzle pieces together, in terms of not only just the note, but really about how the strengths model works together. The focus is always on either furthering out a client's goal or trying to get to a client's goal. So you don't even have to come in exactly with that goal, but you're always looking for it. And in terms of medical necessity, it's, what is your role in that? And then the interventions, in a sense, speak to that role, so that, that just because a client has a goal does not mean that we're naturally involved in it. We may only be involved in one small aspects of it, or with some people we may be involved in a large portion of it. And then the documentation ties that together. So like with Elizabeth, her goal was living on her own. The things that were barriers for her was really the suicidal thoughts, the voices, the depression that she experienced. And so the interventions really kind of went towards that. Now, even though there were practical, tangible steps that they did to help her actually get into an apartment, these things were always, in a sense, brought to the forefront. And even though we're talking about things that are deficits, it was really her strengths that were started to work in terms of how they were applied to help, or applied to help her overcome some of these barriers. And then, of course, the storyline that follows here along this journey is your documentation. So when we think about teaching the strengths model, we really never want to teach the documentation. We want to really teach practitioners how to become very highly skilled at these practices and then teach them how to document weaving these practices into the storyline. I went really quick, but I really wanted to try to stay on time this time before I went into the second part of this webinar. But I want to stop real quick and just find out, before we come into Jacob, about what questions that you have to this point.
Rick, this is Karen, and we do have one that has been chatted in from Jeffrey Kukral, and he asks, would it not also be the best place to write cultural observations?
Yes. One thing that we, we've had this model implemented in lots of different contexts, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, the Netherlands, several different. And one thing that they've noticed is that, that it's pretty culturally resilient, because it doesn't really necessarily say how you interpret someone's culture. But I would say for a lot of people, a person's culture influences a lot of ways of those strengths. And that's why when you write it in terms of what is the meaning and importance to that particular person. You know, and it's good to ask people those questions and understand it. So most definitely, it's a great way to capture it.
And I don't, at this point, see any hands raised, or no more questions have come in. If you do want to speak up and ask a question, please raise your hand, and I will take you off of mute. Okay, Wendy, I'm taking you off of mute. Wendy Kabil? Can you hear us, Wendy? I see you had your hand raised. I think maybe we have answered your question through the question box.
Any other questions?
Hang on, there was another question. Christine Bentley, I'm going to take you off of mute. Christine? Okay, I think some of these questions we may have resolved through the question box. So be sure, Wendy, we cannot hear you. I see that you submitted your question, or submitted a response in the question box. Go ahead and put your question in the box, and we'll try to get to that as soon as we can. Rick, at this point, let's go ahead and move on.
Okay, so now to really kind of talk more about the strengths assessment, we want to introduce another person. And this is a person that I didn't specifically work with, but it was on a team that we were implementing the strengths model, and you know, a worker was just trying to learn the strengths assessment. So, you know, usually what we do is that to learn the strengths assessment is that we just have a person pick someone and go out there and try it, and come back the next week. We talk about the learning, what went well, what didn't. And Jacob was one of those people that he had chose just because he thought, you know, I just wonder how he would respond to this. So what we did, like with Jacob, I mean, what we did with Elizabeth is that we gave you a picture of what Elizabeth's life was looking like at the beginning of her journey to recovery, and then we looked at it from the end of the story, where she's at right now. We're going to do the same thing with Jacob. Jacob was a little bit more recent than Elizabeth, but he was a 26-year-old, still is, well, no, he's not 26 now, but 26-year-old African-American gay man. He was living at that time with his brother, his sister-in-law, 2 nephews. He had a partner, Jeffrey, who that relationship had only been going on for less than a year, but it was very important to him. He grew up, spent a lot of time in psychiatric residential treatment facilities as a teen. He dropped out of school before his senior year of high school. Lots of drugs and alcohol abuse. Definitely had started very early on in his life and was continuing up to the time that this case manager was working with him. Suicidal attempts, not as bad as Elizabeth's, but definitely factored into that. He had been out of the hospital at this point for about a year, so in some ways he had already taken some strides in his recovery. Probably would say that, you know, he was more of stable, even, you know, still with the drugs and alcohol, but he was definitely viewed as a high risk just because of the seriousness of his suicide attempts in the past, and the fact that there really wasn't a lot that was keeping some stability in his life. He was viewed by the team and his worker as a person who was often very difficult to engage, and not that I ever liked the word compliant, but that was something that they would refer to a lot, that you know, when he's doing well, he's very compliant. When he's not doing well, he's not compliant at all. But to show that there was at least some hope on there is that he was, even in the midst of all that was going on, he was still fighting. You know, he was working on this GED, and there was a reason behind that. And I think that was the reason that the worker wanted to kind of use the strengths assessment, because it was, you know, there's a lot of messy stuff going on, but I see this guy as there's more to it. there's something that's keeping him fighting, even in the midst of a lot of struggle. So that's when he, introduced the strengths assessment and a lot of the other things. So where's Jacob now? Here at the beginning of 2016, he does now have his own apartment. He's living with Jeffrey. Doesn't mean that everything's always going perfect, but they do have actually managed to do very well together. He did finish his GED. He's now enrolled for a fine arts degree in a community college. He's now been sober and off hard drugs for 2 years, and I say hard drugs on that is that he's still occasional marijuana use, but he's definitely off some of the drugs that really debilitated him several years before, and that was the longest time he'd ever been clean since he was 14 years old. And he still has a lot of trouble with mood regulations, but he fights for it differently now. Before I think he had a lot of sometimes difficulty just keeping his composure, and now he fights even harder on that level. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you see Jacob's initial strengths assessment, and this was the actual strengths assessment. The only difference on it, some of the names have been changed and stuff just to keep it from being identified, but the content is basically all there, and of course it's been typed up. And so what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you take a look at the strengths assessment and tell me what you think of it. I think you, Karen, is it true that they have a copy of this, or, oh no, we only have it from the slides. So I think what I'll do is that, I'll kind of go from, one slide to the other, but what I want you to do is I want you to put on your supervisor's hat and take about 5 minutes. And, what happened within our group experience here is that Jacob turned in his strengths assessment to the supervisor, and then the supervisor called me and said, could you review the strengths assessment with me and tell me if this is any good or not? So that's what I want you to do right now, is put on your supervisor's hat, and if one of your staff went out and did a strengths assessment and this is what they came back with, what feedback would you give them? So take about 5 minutes. I'll probably leave it on this screen for about a minute, and then I'll flip over to the other one and then flip back again. Okay, I'm gonna turn it all over to you now, and let me just get some opinions from you. I mean, is this a good strengths assessment? Is it a bad strengths assessment? What are your thoughts on it? And I think Karen, they could just raise their hand and make some comment.
Raise their hand, or go ahead and write into the questions, and I'll read them out. I see one note here. It says, I would like the case manager to help Jacob dig a bit deeper, especially on past resources. That came from Diane Lucas.
Okay.
Lisa Winch suggested that we might want to, what might he want to study in college? Maybe art. What did he like doing with his brother's kids?
Good. Is it good or is it bad?
More that can be, yeah, there seems to be more that can be asked about the skills he uses with the brother's kids. That came from James McEwen. Another one about the plan to use art and a coping skill from Leanne Culbertson.
Okay.
Andy Gonzalez agrees with Diane's feedback and would have the case manager identify some strengths in the cultural and spiritual domain. Show appreciation to the case manager for trying this out, from Krista Underwood. His history of sobriety could have been noted as a strength, from Jaquetta Adewolf. So some good feedback coming in.
Good. Well, actually, you know, you're overall, I think you're pretty positive about it, which is a great sign. You know, that's not really how the supervisor was. This particular supervisor was really excited about the strengths model, and I think the supervisor really got it. But sometimes then we can impose, you know, like what we should or should not have when people actually go out and use this tool. And so for me, of saying whether this is a good one or a bad one, it really depends on the context of you know, who is Jacob, what's he like, and what is the relationship between Jacob and the case manager. You know, if Jacob is a person who rarely speaks about anything and is mostly, you know, kind of introverted, not necessarily that great of a relationship with the worker, well, then this is a great strengths assessment. The fact that he even got this amount, even if it's sparse, you know, except if Jacob would have been a person who, you know what, you know, they've had a great relationship, they've known each other for 3 years, you know, it's like you probably have more that you should already know, or things that you could draw out on that. This kind of falls somewhere in between. You know, they were starting to build a decent relationship, but there was still, you know, there still wasn't a lot of trust built between the two. And what really makes this a good strengths assessment is the fact that it starts to get at the essence of who Jacob is. And to me, that's, when teaching people how to do this, that's really all I want them to do in the beginning. You know, and even if they are only spending 5 or 10 minutes or 15, you know, if they can capture that. And if you think about Jacob here, a lot of things pop out, you know, that he does care about his nephews. I mean, and he's proud of it. You know, when he says he's great at helping, there's some pride in that. The fact that art pops all over the place shows that he has some passion around it, and definitely worth exploring. The fact about the importance of Jeffrey, you know, pops out there. The importance of family. You know, the fact that even though he was using, he has goals. You know, so it's not just getting the GED, but he wants to go to community college. He wants to do something with his life, even though his priority right now is that I just want to get my own place. So here's what happened is that, you know, we had a great discussion as a team, you know, just about this particular strengths assessment. And, you know, what the worker did was went back and started to explore a lot of those areas that you're, you know, putting into the chat line, or that you've already expressed. There's so many areas now that you can explore. So what I want to show you now is that what did the strengths assessment look like as it evolved over time. And so once again, I want you to just take about, you know, less than 5 minutes of just taking a look at this. And the question I really want you to answer is that, is this useful information for you as a practitioner? You know, of taking the time to be able to get these things. What is the value that it brings in terms of working with people, and specifically helping people make progress in their recovery? So there's 2 parts to this, so I'm going to leave this up for a minute or so, and then I'll slip over to the other one, but just absorb it in a little bit about the differences between this one and the other one. Okay, um, in terms of time, I'm going to go ahead and stop just a little bit early here and see if I can open up to some just feedback of what are your thoughts after seeing this more developed strengths assessment over several sessions and the very first one that you saw?
Rick, I don't have any comments quite yet. Well,
Okay.
one from Christy Schrader indicates it's definitely much more detailed. Leanne Culbertson says, I like it, more complete and detailed. Sherry Abbasi says, clearer focus. Christy Schrader says, has more strengths to utilize.
Anyone want to actually speak to the fact of how this would be useful in terms of doing recovery-oriented work?
Sharon, if you take a look and see who raises their hand, I'm going to go ahead and continue to share some of the feedback because there's quite a bit coming in. So Rick, we'll keep our eye out for the raised hand. I can see more personal connection and insight about who he is, what his desires are, and what he's hoping for from Anna Karakamo. The revised version is more personal and specific as to why from Jamie Garcia. And you can see his life on paper and how he feels about his life from Lisa Godoy. Jaquetta Adewal says it does a better job of drawing out his strengths, makes it more personal. Gives more indication of where the client is at and what he's working toward from Diane Lucas. Evidence that a good strength assessment should be done in more than one session from Catherine Rexroth.
Most definitely.
Yeah, he appears to be more invested in recovery from Mary Beth Capon. Became more personal and well thought out, seems to express a sense of hope from Jennifer Barze. Expressing his hopes and dreams from Mary Beth Capon. Its individualized person drives the recovery forward movement from Yana Dick. Would be very helpful in making true connection with the individual from Jamie Garcia. Very specific desires and aspirations from Sherry Bossi. Looks like the relationship is improving from Larry Powell. You get a much better picture of who Jacob is, has perspective. Oh my gosh, there's all sorts of great things coming in here. So,
good.
Rick, I don't know if you want to explore them more. They're flying in.
You know, one thing for me is I've been married over 18 years now, and actually I met my wife through from doing mental health work. I was working in a homeless program as a case manager and then the team leader there, and she started off in crisis services. And you know, even after we dated and got married and stuff, you know, I never like said, you know, you really should be doing a strengths assessment, but with people. But it's really amazing that she's a therapist and has now kind of just made this a central part of things that she does with people. So, and it doesn't change all the other great skills that she brings into it. She does a lot of great cognitive behavioral therapy. She does lots of things that are derived from dialectical behavioral therapy. But the strengths assessment has become a very prime tool in terms of helping her align with people before they start a lot of that work, and then continues along so they can really start to think about how can they, you know, how can we document that people are starting to acquire certain things or reshape of what we're learning about them and how they're applying it to their recovery. So, you know, I think there's, you know, I talked about this as a case management model, but even in that, you know, I see evidence of a lot of therapists or even support employment workers who have taken to this kind of tool and found it very valuable in terms of the work that they're doing.
Real quick, there's a good thought that you might react to, and comes from Trevor Blackwell. I'm concerned that there is limited information on the spiritual cultural side. This has more details to assist with goals.
Yeah. You know, one thing about it is that since it's not an interview, You don't have to fill out every box, but what it is these are places to capture things as they evolve in the discussion. So for some people that you'll see a very flushed out spirituality and culture section, and some people don't even want to address it or talk about it, but it's always there, and it's a repository where you can put those things on. Actually, we're doing a study right now of evaluating just that particular item on the strengths assessment about how spirituality and culture play a role in terms of people's recovery, and it's very fascinating. Jacobs did not have a lot on there. In fact, that's the only thing he really had to say in that particular area. But, if spirituality starts to be shaped as something that's important to him, that he sees in terms of part of his recovery, there's a place to put it. But it's spirituality culture was not on the very original strengths assessment that was developed. There was only 6 life domains, but it was really within our own state, people with the lived experience of mental illness that actually advocated for us adding that on there. And so it's a lot of people saying that that this is an important part of their own recovery, and that they wanted a place to be able to express that. So that's why it's there. So let me go on a little bit. I want to look at some progress notes on here. Actually, I'm just going to look at one here, because the important part is using these as examples of what is the underlying practice that's really kind of going on here. And what we're starting to do is set up things that we'll keep building on through each session that hopefully just keeps taking us down further that road about what this stuff actually looks like in practice. So by taking a look inside the progress note, you can see a little bit about how this was developing for Jacob and his worker, in that the worker actually was a very skilled worker and really took to the strengths assessment very well. Used to write actually very long notes. I'm not always I don't always like really long notes, but I went ahead and took the original note here, and I call it the expanded version. But you can see once again is that it's got all that attributes of that GIRP. It's what was the reason that brought them together. You can see that at intake, that's basically that's the things that Jacob brought to it, is that he wanted help with anxiety, difficulties in a relationship. He wasn't talking about any of those other types of goals until the strengths assessment kind of came into it. But the note kind of starts about where they started from there. But then when you get down to the stuff that's in the pumpkin, is that they introduce the strengths assessment so they can better understand what were these areas of life that were being impacted by the anxiety, and what was he already doing, what was working, what wasn't, and that's where the stuff starts to evolve. So it's a very long note, but sometimes there's different types of notes. Sometimes notes are more expanding type notes, where you're starting to develop some storylines that maybe after that they get a little bit shorter, and sometimes notes are a little bit more consolidating, where they fit along a string of several of them, where we just focused on a few things today, and here it is. But if you read all of the notes together, it puts things in a better context. You have access to all these slides, and so you're welcome to spend a little bit more time of looking at these notes. It's not that this was a bad note, but I went ahead and rewrote the note a little bit, made it a little bit more condensed. So the expanded version was his writing. This is actually kind of how I just condensed it a little bit. It's still a long note, and then I went ahead and just put it in the GIRP format, so that you can kind of see how those things break down. And for me, it actually looks a little bit less overwhelming when you kind of break it down. But the important part is that when we think about where we're going with this is starting to think about that there's a systemic kind of way that we're approaching practice in this. And in the strengths model, everything hinges on client-centered goal identification and achievement. So what we would say is that level A practice that's defined there is a way that you kind of approach every client that you work with. So if we were asking you to score this from a practitioner level, we would be saying, consider all the people that you're serving right now. If you have a caseload of 20, 25, or what you have, is that focus of your work being driven by finding that goal? Either you have the goal or you're searching for it. And then it doesn't mean that you're not looking at problems, barriers, and challenges, but they're starting to be discussed in the context of how they relate to that goal. Are there things about the barriers that are getting in the way of that goal, that impact it? So any work that's being done has relevance to the person. That's how you engage them. You see so many times you see notes where people are trying to get people to take care of their hygiene, but it's absent any type of relevance to the person or any context of why they would even want to do that. Or even things like, helping a person to get clean or sober. There's got to be a reason. So how are we tying that in to what is important or meaningful to the person? So we can see that like with Jacob, breaking down those components of that item number 1 is that there's this continual attention to find out what's meaningful and important. And even though that very first strengths assessment that was sparse started to find meaning and importance, we're not done with it. It kept going further. It was that, not only do I want a partner, I want it with Jeffrey, and then later on was, I want to be an art teacher. So just the active ingredients are continuously being developed over time. And those problems are viewed in the context. So, yes, it was true that Jacob experienced anxiety. He had alcohol and drug use, depression, and there were lots of interventions that were actually used to try to help him with those things, and that's where a lot of that disengagement was happening, or what was viewed as he was difficult to engage, because it wasn't in a context that was about, well, how do I help you overcome some of this anxiety or the drug and alcohol use so that you can actually have this relationship with Jeffrey that you want. So then all the interventions that are relevant to the person. So now we can use motivational interviewing to discuss why you may want to make changes towards getting their to actually doing the hard work of getting clean or sober, or dialectical behavioral therapy to manage mood dysregulation. So we can also look at this from not only just a caseload view, but we really want people to start thinking of this from an organizational view. Is this the way that we approach all clients that we work with? And so we'll see the same thing with strengths. Not only are we trying to get to a goal, but we're trying to also identify strengths that'll help them either to overcome the barrier or to achieve the goal. So like in Jacob's, there was this continual attention to get their strengths in the most usable form. So it's not just that he likes art, but that painting helps him to feel less anxious. It redirects his focus. And seeing some power in what is ordinary. So for him, just drawing just was something that he just kind of did for fun. But now it's kind of like he's skilled at it, and he goes to the part to do things with it. Now it's an important component of his recovery. And the big thing is helping people find this perfect niche. Jacob had a lot of hard time finding his place in a lot of places in the community, but now all of a sudden this niche became Jeffrey, his family, his art, etc., and eventually community college. I'm going to skip over that, but what I want to do is I'm going to set up the next part that we're talking about is that, a lot of times we think as a workers that we can't do this until the organization makes it to where we can do this. And definitely what we see is that it works better when an organization kind of orients itself to this practice. But, if I take my own journey of using the strengths assessment, when I was a case manager, I just ran this covert strengths operation. I was still learning the tool. I started out with a few clients, and I was just learning about what worked and what didn't work. It wasn't a recognized tool that we put in the chart. I just kept it in a folder. I'm not sure that would really meet good HIPAA requirements now, but at that time it was just in a folder. But the outcomes were being noticed. I was starting to get high employment rates, keeping people out of the hospital, and I was attributing that to the work that I was doing with the tools. So that kind of led to becoming a team leader, where all of a sudden it's like it now became more visible. It was still an optional tool in the agency, but now it was being put in the chart, and now we were teaching case managers how to use that and actually setting time aside to actually review strengths assessments and give feedback, kind of like what we just did there with Jacob and the supervisor. And also I was starting to go out in the field to actually model how to use strengths assessments, and learning from clients was just the best way to really actually get feedback on this tool, the beginning of what we're going to talk about later on in field mentoring. But definitely as a director, this is where things really start to come together, where we started making it the foundational approach of how we did our services. Doesn't mean that we were the greatest agency, doesn't mean we're always perfect, but it started to guide our thinking, how we did things. And so doing the tools now, which includes the strengths assessment, will be included in job description, performance evaluations, and a lot of the focus was really about how do we eliminate barriers to people using these tools. So things like how do we eliminate other paperwork, how do we condense meetings, etc. How do we structure the role of the supervisor? So I'm going to turn that over now to Lisa, which is a great example of somebody who at a direct service level has taken this tool and really done some great things with it. So with that, I'm just going to turn it right over to you, Lisa.
Okay, I am Lisa. All right, thanks. So I want to say just a few things before we get into two quick cases. One is that I always learn something that I didn't know about clients every time I do a strengths assessment. That's one of the most exciting things. It also seems like an easy tool to use, and I want to say it is and it isn't. I kind of consider it to be sort of an art form. It's definitely something that you want to do in a kind of conversational way. You want to bring in everything that you know about the person. My preference has been to not necessarily do it at the very upfront, but I could see it being a good engagement tool. But for me, it's better when I know the person a little bit, and so I tend to do it a couple months into the relationship with the person. Because people sometimes have a hard time identifying their strengths. So it helps when I say, hey, didn't you mention to me about this? Or sometimes when a person mentions a goal, gosh, I really am lonely, I'd like to meet some more women. Then, oh, wow, you know, I hear a goal there. Then I'll pull out the strengths assessment, and then that'll be a trigger to kind of getting started. So I first want to talk about a client, Jonathan. Jonathan is a 52-year-old Ethiopian and Latino man that was referred by his PCP. Really, his primary complaint has always been insomnia, but it's sort of come out that he has some depressive symptoms as well. He's kind of a loner. He lives in an SRO. He'd been seen at the clinic before, but just returned after a couple years of moving to a different city. He works as a massage therapist, but he says he doesn't really like it anymore. He doesn't like touching people, which would make it really hard to do a good job in that field. So he's considering changing the field, his work field. May want to study accounting. And if you could go to the strengths assessment. So he's also pretty, he's not extremely verbal. So it kind of took a lot to get some of this out of him. And something really interesting that I learned about him around this moving into a place with a kitchen so he can bake. I really loved how Rick talked about just fleshing out each goal. And the more you can flesh it out and ask, what is it about that you like? What is your history with that? What would that look like? So, you know, what is it about baking? And then all of a sudden he just opened up and this whole flood came out of, you know, I'm a really good baker. I've got these 2 specialized recipes for peanut butter cookies and lemon cakes, and started telling me the recipe, and just it led to this incredible kind of motivation and feeling of, you know, I'd really miss baking. I really would love to get back to it. Also, I found out that he used to be into bike racing and weightlifting, which I didn't know, and he set goals in those areas that he wanted to not do them as a hobby, but really to, quote, get into the sport of it. Yeah, I found out that he is a Mormon, didn't know that about him. He's not that connected, but he did reflect that he'd like to get a little more connected. So if you could go back to page 1 for a second of the strengths assessment. Yeah. So the baking thing kind of just became this big thing, and there was a whole momentum around it. And I want to speak just for a minute to kind of what happens sometimes and how you use yourself as the clinician and the relationship to work on things that come up. So he got so motivated that he went out and he priced some convection ovens. And unfortunately, it turned out they were prohibitively expensive, and he just got really, really demoralized and frustrated. So then he brought that into the session, and then that was fodder for, you know, okay, now we're going to process this and deal with the disappointment of it and brainstorm some alternatives and what options are there. And then he had the thought about, well, maybe I could get some bakery work where I could learn more about, you know, how to do this, or even maybe rent a space in a bakery to do my little baked goods and then go out and sell them. And a whole narrative came out about his entrepreneurial spirit, which was just really exciting. So you will run into absolutely barriers and blocks, and that's where you come into play and help people deal with those things. But I also love that this whole strengths assessment is a living, breathing tool. So you'll see at the top under home living, you know, at the end, more recently in our relationship, he became so overwhelmed with the cost of living in San Francisco, which you can imagine is pretty high. He lives in an SRO hotel, but he's really not able to save any money. So he made a decision that, you know what, I may need to consider moving out of the area. So that became the goal. So things are shifting as you're using it. You can add to it, you can cross things out, you can change it. Okay. And then maybe we can move on to the next person, who is Helen. Helen is a 64-year-old woman that has been here for several years. When I got the case, she had been seeing a therapist that retired, and she had had a couple serious suicide attempts in her past. She's with a long-term partner who was helpful to her. A lot of her issues centered around her mood problems, being really depressed, and her partner has chronic pain issues, and so does she. She volunteered at a local Jewish community center, even though she's not Jewish. Her partner, because of his Parkinson's, they decided they wanted to move to the Central Valley at some point down the road to be nearer to his daughter and her family so that she could help care for them. So let's move on to the strengths assessment. Okay, can you move to the strengths assessment?
Is that not on it?
No.
Huh.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So it starts out with her wanting to do some kind of preparation stuff for possibly moving to Bakersfield at some point, but that was way into the future. She wants to get out of the house more. There's a lot of themes of wanting to connect socially, especially with other women, also do creative things. She had a history of doing paper mache and some other kinds of things. She explored a lot about her Australian background. That's where she was born and raised, and she wanted to learn more about that side of her family and eventually get back there. So this was one that was done over many, many sessions. And then I pulled it out again because things dramatically changed at one point. Helen had knee pain issues because of arthritis, and so a huge crimp came into, her whole life. I mean, life happened for her, and so this health issue started really impairing a lot of her strength. She was no longer able to, she had 31 stairs to her apartment. She couldn't navigate it up and down on a daily basis. Therefore, she stopped going to her volunteer opportunity over at the Jewish Community Center. She stopped getting out of the house that much. She got more depressed. A lot of our work focused on advocacy around getting a good orthopedic, medical treatment, getting pain medication as needed, and figuring out a plan around the knees. So something that happened was that the plan to move to Bakersfield just kind of moved front and center, and then it became about that. And you can see where I put a star up in the box under home and daily living. I want to move to Bakersfield in a one-story house with a yard, no stairs. So things really can shift, and that to me is an example of how this is really a living, breathing document, and how it just needs to get modified. You just pull it out, and it's cool how it just becomes messy, and it's just got all kinds of stuff all on it. Or as a new strength comes up, then I'll just say, oh, let's add that to the strength assessment, should we? And then we do. But I just see it as one of the most profound tools that I use in my practice because it instills hope. I visibly see people kind of sit up taller as you're talking with them and working with them on this. I don't do it in any way in a linear fashion. I let them start which category they'd like to talk about, which temporal area. I highly recommend really fleshing it out as much as you can. What would that look like? Why do you want that? What is it about that appeals to you? Get down to the nitty-gritty of it, and then that's where people just really connect on it. So I think we're going to move on to Gloria in just a moment, and I want to say I can relate a little bit to what Rick talked about being a covert strengths operator here. Sometimes I feel like it's sort of a stealth strengths operation, but I will say it's really our clinic participated in the ARC, the Advancing Recovery Collaborative, and it was very powerful, and I do see that the strengths-based model is kind of starting to permeate our clinic a little bit, and I definitely am getting a lot of results, and I definitely attribute a lot of the positive results to the use of the strengths assessment and the strengths-based model. Okay, so that's my piece.
So Gloria, you're up next. Lisa, thank you so much for sharing a bit about your practice and what the strength assessment has brought to your practice and to your clients. Very exciting. Gloria, are you there? Okay, Gloria, we're not hearing you, so you may have mute on your system. Okay, tell you what, let me, well, go ahead, Rick, and go to my slides, and then Gloria, pipe up once you're connected. So I'm going to give you a little bit about next steps. How do we get answers to your questions? So I'm going to give you one response. We've had a really wonderful array of questions come in. If we do not have enough time today to answer them all, we'll get to them online, but the key at this stage is to try it. So we strongly recommend, we've sent out with the materials, the blank strength assessment, and I think you've heard a lot about different techniques to go for it. A lot about the strength assessment is finding your way to use it and getting some experience with how it's different than documentation and maybe different than the way you typically have done assessment, how it's woven into all of your visits with clients. It's not just something you do annually, but all the time. Just give it a go with one or two clients. Be brave and see what it's like, because I think you'll discover that there's a wonderful wind of opportunity that emerges from it. And for those who do try it, we would love to hear what your experience is, because we'd like to do some shared learning around this. So for folks that went out and had some ahas, please let me know if you're willing to share a bit, and we'll make sure we have time next time on the next webinar to hear from some stories of folks that have tried it. What we're setting the stage for is the next session, which is session 3, identifying meaningful goals and developing a plan to achieve them. That will be 1 month from today, Wednesday, March 2nd, from 12 to 1:30. Rick, and I want to just ask you to talk a little bit about the strength assessment versus the strength assessment and goal achievement.
You mean the personal recovery plan?
Yes.
Yeah, it's really they have to go together. It's one thing to get people excited. I love what Lisa was talking about. You start seeing people kind of sit up a little bit. They kind of start to think about the possible, and that's a common response that we get from people. But you can take that completely hope-inducing experience and then crush it if we don't try to take some movement. And so, it's not that the personal recovery plan is the only way to do it, but it definitely is the companion piece of the strengths assessment. And you'll get a chance to see that about, that once we've come to, some alignment on a meaningful and important goal, it's really talking about how do we break that thing down into such a way that people can actually start to make progress. It's really about starting to really get people in motion. Whether it goes a few steps forward and back, it doesn't matter. It's getting people in motion.
Great. So we don't want, and I think that the message here is it's just the strength assessment alone won't get it done. It's a valuable and necessary component, and in fact, just talking about strength and not acting on strength can have a rebound effect. So we want to be careful for that. We also, next slide, Rick. Oh, here, yeah, I forgot we had this slide. So here's a bit more about what's going to be covered in that session, understanding why goals are not achieved, setting meaningful and important goals, using highly individualized and specific strengths to support goal achievement. Obviously, that's a big output from and benefit of the strength assessment. Planning to achieve those goals by breaking them into smaller measurable steps, and that's the personal recovery plan that Rick just referenced. Tools and methods and strategies to keep things moving forward. So, building on what we've been covering today, we'll go into some great depth next time with gaining that progress. We do recommend, next slide, that you complete the strength orientation scale, the practice orientation scale. It really helps you begin to think about, well, where am I and where are we in relation to the different levels of practice, and where do we want to be? What's our aim? What are we aiming to achieve? And having that clarity. And since I think, Gloria, we have unfortunately had some sound connection problems, I think we will make sure to have Gloria in our next call talk about how San Francisco as an agency is embracing the wellness recovery philosophy and aims, and how Gloria in her role is supporting that, and to support folks like Lisa to have greater experience with that. Rick, we have had quite a few questions, and I'm wanting to go ahead and have you answer them. And my question box, hang on, has gone away. There was a question about where do you write medical necessity. I can't remember the question, and my question box disappeared. Okay, well, anybody else want to chat in questions?
I can kind of address that question, even though you don't have it all flushed out. But I think there is a question about, where do we put the barriers and challenges on there? And there's a reason for not putting them on the strengths assessment, and the reason is, and we've seen different agencies when we've watched them use it, that start to try to combine those things. What usually happens is that the strengths just get pushed out, and it just becomes this whole repository of the barriers, challenges, and deficits. A lot of times, the challenges and barriers are sometimes well known, and there's other places that you can document those. There's lots of different tools where you can uncover things. But what it does is it amplifies those things that we're bringing to the table to help people overcome those problems, barriers, and challenges. Now, there is a place that sometimes they do seep into the strengths assessment. Like for example, that you could get a hint of anxiety and the role of anxiety for Jacob, but the way it was kind of put down was the fact of that what helped him. So if somebody has anxiety, it's like, well, what does help you? Or if a person hears voices, you can put that on there, is that doing this helps to soften the voices. So what you don't want to do is just put in just a deficit, because then the question would be is that, well, how is that deficit a strength? We're more interested in thinking about, like, what do you do in relation to a challenge that you do experience.
Great. Another question from Michael Isman was, do you give a copy to the client each time you update it? Where do you keep it in the chart? How do you connect this to the treatment plan? It plays out different ways. We have some agencies that have used like carbon copy paper and done it that way. Sometimes that we've had where the worker will then bring, if they've scratched on it, that they would actually make a copy and bring it with them the next time they get together. Of course, if the visit was there in the office or they have access to a photocopier, they can do it right then. We've even seen where clients have actually written on their own copy along with the worker. So I mean, there's no definite way that you have to do it, but it is important to keep in mind that the tool actually is the client's, and that's really important, and we've actually seen well-written strengths assessments where, a client will actually keep a copy in their purse, or, I've seen them before where they've actually put them up on a refrigerator by a magnet, and one of those ones that I remember most is that a woman who was trying to she was trying to regain custody of her kid, and she was really kind of getting completely down on herself, and there was that one part in the strengths assessment that popped out to her the most was where I wrote a comment that she was a devoted mother, and she had said, like, do you really think that? And I said, well, yeah, I do. Because of the fact that you continue to fight and that you continue to do these things, and so I don't know, but you do want to get into their hands because it's really about their narrative shifting. That's the most important part than it is that you know these strengths. It's important that they know them. And so, Rick, I'm going to give James Brent an opportunity to speak up. He has raised his hand. And James, if you're able to speak into your computer, I'm going to take you off mute. You have also self-muted, James, so if you want to ask Rick a question. Okay. Okay, well, like I said, we've received many questions in the menu. We will go through them and send out an email with more specific answers, but also some of the best answers are going to come from you're trying it. So really strongly recommend that you just go give it a go. And many questions will be answered for you that way. But we'll do some more homework on our end to be responsive to your inquiries. And thank you so much for your time. We're 2 minutes over. Apologize for that. Lisa, thank you again for your wonderful presentation and discussion of strength assessment in your practice. Rick, likewise, really tremendous presentation and quite interesting and useful. Gloria, we look forward to next time. We'll solve the sound problem. Sharon, thanks for your technical support, and everybody have a great afternoon. We look forward to the call next time. Have a great afternoon.